Chapter 15: Autotelic Living and the Reclaimed Self. One of the quiet tragedies of modern life is how many people spend years pursuing lives that never truly felt like their own. They move from expectation to expectation, role to role, comparison to comparison, achievement to achievement, without ever fully pausing to ask, what actually feels deeply alive to me beneath performance, approval, fear, tribe, and imitation? This question becomes difficult partly because human beings are so socially shaped. Desire, identity, ambition, morality, and meaning are constantly influenced by external forces. Family expectations, cultural narratives, status hierarchies, comparison structures, tribe loyalty, economic incentives, and the emotional rewards of belonging. Over time, many people lose contact with the difference between what genuinely animates them and what they learn to pursue for approval, security, admiration, or identity. This disconnection often produces a subtle form of inner fragmentation. A person may appear successful externally while feeling strangely absent from their own life internally. They fulfill obligations, perform identities, meet expectations, achieve milestones, and accumulate markers of competence or status, yet some deeper part of the self remains psychologically undernourished. Not because the achievements are meaningless, but because meaning cannot be sustained indefinitely through external orientation alone. At some point, the psyche begins quietly asking, what belongs to me underneath all the conditioning? This question sits near the center of autotelic living. The word autotelic refers to activities or ways of being experienced as meaningful in themselves rather than merely as instruments for external reward. An autotelic person increasingly organizes life around intrinsic engagement rather than constant validation, comparison, or social performance. This does not mean withdrawing from society or abandoning ambition entirely. It means the center of gravity gradually shifts inward. The person begins orienting less around applause, status, ideological belonging, image management, comparison, or external metrics, and more around coherence, curiosity, meaning, engagement, conscious participation, and alignment with deeply examined values. This shift often feels psychologically different. Externally driven life tends to produce chronic emotional volatility because the self becomes dependent upon unstable systems of evaluation. Praise elevates identity. Rejection destabilizes it. Comparison distorts satisfaction. Achievement temporarily relieves insecurity before generating new forms of striving. The nervous system remains externally tethered. An autotelic orientation changes the emotional texture of experience itself. The person becomes increasingly capable of engaging deeply with life for its own sake, learning for the joy of understanding, creating for the experience of creation, loving for the experience of connection, building because building feels meaningful, exploring because curiosity itself feels alive, reflecting because awareness matters intrinsically. This orientation creates a quieter and more stable form of fulfillment, not permanent happiness, not immunity from suffering. Something more grounded than that. A sense that life is being inhabited from within rather than merely performed outwardly. This distinction matters enormously because modern culture often conditions people to organize identity almost entirely around external outcomes. Success becomes measured through visibility, prestige, productivity, wealth, moral signaling, popularity, or public recognition. Even self-improvement can become another performance structure, where individuals endlessly optimize themselves for approval. Under these conditions, people may gradually lose contact with intrinsic experience altogether. They no longer ask, what feels meaningful? Only, what performs well socially? The result is often chronic restlessness. Because externally organized identity rarely produces stable coherence. The standards remain externally generated and therefore endlessly shifting. There is always another comparison, another hierarchy, another performance arena, another identity to maintain. The self becomes exhausted from continuous external negotiation. Autotelic living interrupts this cycle, not by rejecting the world completely, but by reclaiming deeper authorship over attention, values, and meaning. This reclamation usually begins quietly. A person notices which activities produce genuine absorption rather than performative display. They begin distinguishing between what energizes them intrinsically and what merely delivers social reward. They pay attention to moments where self-consciousness temporarily dissolves and engagement itself becomes sufficient. These moments often resemble what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described as flow, states where attention becomes fully immersed in meaningful engagement. The person is no longer primarily monitoring external evaluation. The activity itself becomes absorbing enough that the usual anxieties of self-performance temporarily recede. This matters psychologically because it reveals something important. Human beings often feel most alive when attention becomes fully engaged in intrinsically meaningful participation rather than endless self-monitoring. In these moments, the fragmented self briefly reorganizes into coherence. The person is no longer split between appearance and reality, performance and participation, external reward and internal meaning. They are simply present. Over time, this orientation can begin extending beyond isolated moments into broader patterns of living. The person becomes more careful about borrowed ambition, more skeptical of socially inherited definitions of success, more attentive to whether choices genuinely align with examined values or merely reinforce external identity structures. This does not eliminate responsibility, ambition, or social participation, but it changes the relationship to them. A person may still pursue excellence, achievement, influence, or recognition. The difference is that these no longer fully define the center of the self. External success becomes part of life, rather than the primary mechanism through which identity and worth are constructed. This creates increasing self-possession, not because the person becomes perfectly independent of others, but because they become less psychologically owned by external evaluation. The reclaimed self, therefore, is not a perfectly pure or fully autonomous self, hidden beneath society waiting to be uncovered. Human beings remain relational, social, conditioned creatures throughout life. No one escapes influence entirely. The reclaimed self is something subtler. It is the self becoming increasingly conscious of what shapes it while gradually choosing deeper alignment over unconscious imitation. It is the self becoming more internally authored, more deliberate, more coherent, more capable of inhabiting life directly rather than merely performing versions of life inherited from tribe, comparison, fear, or social expectation. And perhaps this is one of the clearest signs that the examined mind is maturing into self-possession. The person no longer asks only, "How should I appear?" They begin asking, "What kind of life actually feels true to inhabit from within?"